So as democracy expanded and empowered the people, rose people up from being, overly poor versus the overly rich, and there was a bit of more of a medium area in between, we started to have symphony orchestras, which were performing groups, not just for the rich people, but for anybody who had the money to come see a performance. This was a big deal because now anybody could enjoy high art. Now, what high art would they pick? Well, symphony orchestras, it's their job to pick music that's going to sell tickets, right? If no one's going to buy a ticket to come see you, you don't make any money, so what's the point of performing it? They had to pick music that was going to make them money. So in the mid 1800s, they were going back through all these old pieces of music that were written, usually performed once, maybe twice, and finding the quality bits. The symphony orchestra became very, very popular, and this was shortly after the death of Beethoven. Really, the latter few years of Beethoven's life was during this time period, so his music was perfect for it. So symphony orchestras would perform Beethoven's music. People would pay to come see it, say, this was great. Now I feel fancy because I've experienced high art. Look at me, I'm cool. Well, when something sells, what do? You do it again, and you do it again. And so for really the last 170 years at least, Beethoven's music has been performed regularly by symphony orchestras. If you were to go downtown Springfield, the Springfield Symphony Orchestra performs Beethoven usually once a year when there's not a virus ruining all of our concerts. If you were to go to Boston, Massachusetts, one of the greatest musical groups in the entire planet, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, performs Beethoven multiple times a year. If you were to go to New York City, to the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, down at Lincoln Center, down near Central Park, they perform Beethoven all the time. So this is part of the reason that Beethoven's name is so big. So now we got to decide, should it be? Let's take a listen to some of his music. Beethoven wrote a lot of music in his lifetime, a lot of incredible pieces of music, but we're just going to focus in on just a very small sample of those today. And in particular, we're going to focus in on a type of song Beethoven was really most known for and is still performed more commonly than other pieces of music to this day. And this, of course, is the symphony. Now, what is a symphony? A symphony is just a multi-movement piece for the orchestra. Now, the orchestra, of course, we're talking about violins, viola, cello, bass, some wind instruments, some light percussion as well, a pretty big ensemble. But a multi-movement piece, what that means, you got to remember, this is before the days of albums, records, EPs, or CDs. Multi-movement would mean that you basically would have a composition that had miniature sections in it, maybe like songs that all together were meant to be listened to from start to finish with each movement in a particular order. That's what a symphony was designed as. So some of these symphonies can go as few as 10 to 15 minutes to as long as over an hour. And we actually see that later in Beethoven's work. Now, we're going to focus in mostly on the odd number symphonies that Beethoven wrote. Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies in his lifetime, but what he included is really remarkable. And you probably will recognize many of these without even knowing that they were Beethoven symphonies. The first one we're going to take a look at is his 3rd symphony, nicknamed the Eroica Symphony. As you listen, try to think of what the theme might be. Beethoven finished writing this piece when he was 32 years old. He was starting to deal with a little bit of hearing loss at this point, and he had been having a ringing in his ears for about 5 years and was starting to have a difficult time hearing different things. We can kind of tell this here because when you start to have hearing loss, you start to lose your sensitivity to high-pitched noises, and he starts to use a lot more bass, a lot lower pitches in here. It might be a little bit easier to hear this if you use it with headphones, even for that reason, to really hear the bass. Originally, Beethoven had dedicated this piece of music to Napoleon, who was one of the key figures of the French Revolution. He was leading for power for the people and democracy, but unfortunately, as history tells, Napoleon did a bit of a switch at the end there and declared himself as emperor once he took over all of France. And this really made Beethoven mad. He went up right before the performance, went up to the cover page where it had said, dedicated Napoleon, and scratched his name out, ripped the page off in a huge fit because Napoleon no longer really matched the theme of the piece, which was power to the people and heroicism. Let's take a listen to another one here. You guys probably recognize this one. Some could argue these are the most famous 8 notes in all of classical music. Bum, 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 bum. The idea behind this piece, a lot of people suggest, is fate knocking at the door. Beethoven was starting to truly understand that his hearing was long for this world. He was going deaf. And you could hear the very strong bass sound. It's not really high-pitched in the beginning here. Really was playing to the part of his hearing that he could still really have masterful control of. And very aggressive, dark, in a minor key, as we would say in music. We'll talk about what that means in the coming weeks. Bit of a dark sound, but if you listen here, it takes the same idea and develops it. It's really a beautiful piece of music. While most of us are familiar with the very beginning of it, this is definitely a piece that if you're interested in classical music or want to take a chance of checking something out, listen to the symphony in its entirety across all of its movements. The very end of this symphony, very aggressive. Let's take a look at the next one. Most symphonies are really most well known for either their first movement or their final movement. But this one is very unusual in the sense that Beethoven's remembered in his 7th Symphony for the second movement, kind of like the second song, if you will, second part of the overall symphony program. When this was originally debuted, the crowd allegedly jumped up, stopped, and wanted to stop the performance and say, play it again, we want to hear that second movement again, which is really unusual in the sense that it's the exact same rhythmic idea going on the entire piece, but you could hear it develops. As it goes along, there's more instruments come in, come out, they do more with it. So even though it's the same musical idea over and over, it never really gets stale. Quite remarkable. We're just about out of time again, so I'll see you guys back for part 3 later on. And we'll talk about the challenges that faced Beethoven towards the end of his life, which are pretty interesting for someone to deal with in music. See you then.